All right, so continuing on with our topic of white privilege and seeing how that connects with colorblind racism, I assigned Peggy McIntosh to you, and Peggy McIntosh is very well cited. She was writing her piece in the 1990s, and I think an interesting exercise always is trying to look at the 50 different examples that she lists of her own white privilege, and then trying to see how that compares in 2020, if there are certain items missing from that list or whether there are things that are obsolete now and are no longer relevant. Unfortunately, what we find is that there are several different things from the list that continue to be true in our society. And Peggy McIntosh highlights that the most important aspect of privilege is that it is invisible. She calls it an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, right? So, all metaphors for the different resources we possess just because of our social location. And if you are from the dominant group, you don't notice your privilege. For instance, very rarely do I get home and say to myself, thank goodness I was able to use the restroom of my choice because I have cisgender privilege. So that's the other aspect of privilege we need to grasp. That privilege can come from many different sources, and similarly, there are many different sources of oppression. And I think that point is important because when we try to talk about white privilege, folks often come up with examples of poorer white folks in Appalachia and so on. And the question always becomes like, what privilege are you talking about if these are really poor people? And we have to always specify that we can be privileged in certain aspects of our life and then have disadvantages in other aspects of our life. So I might have social class privilege. Coming from India, I have caste privilege. I have cisgender privilege. I am a US citizen, so I have the privilege of having legal status. At the same time, I am also a woman of color. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that fact because otherwise, some folks don't quite understand what privilege is, right? And then pointing out that privilege is institutional rather than simply interpersonal, right? When we talk about white privilege, that privilege comes from having greater access to power and resources than people of color do, purely on the basis of skin color, right? And so, again, I give you an example of the racism pyramid here, where racism can actually manifest in many different ways. And too often we simply see it as bigotry, and some might argue that in fact it's the more subtle forms of racism that are harder to combat, right? The overt racism is easy to spot and therefore easy to dismiss. But the more subtle forms of racism leave us second guessing, wondering if we were being oversensitive, and so on, right? And then, of course, I have Pocahontas there trying to explain that privilege is not about assigning blame, but it's the first step to undoing injustice. And if you're still wondering about how white privilege operates, there's several different examples here, right? How criminal activity might be portrayed in mass media. Black folks, even when they are victims of violence, are presented in ways that might not evoke empathy, right? Especially the pandemic has brought to light the significance of white privilege, like which are the communities most affected, not only by the disease itself, but by unemployment and access to affordable housing and all of these other things. Our criminal justice system is perhaps the easiest to access in terms of how white privilege makes a difference. And then you have these other examples which don't seem very big, right? So finding band-aids that match our skin tone in the larger scheme of things seems like a small thing. But if you remember from Marlon Fry, oppression means you're looking at the cumulative effect. One of the race scholars described it as 1,000 little cuts, little nicks that you get throughout the day, every single day. And what's the cumulative impact of that, right? So in sociology of race, we are making the case that racism has to be understood as systemic, right? Has to be understood as a system of advantage and disadvantage. Because if you water it down to meaning simply interpersonal prejudice, then we lose that precision of language, right? And it means that we have to acknowledge that in order to change the system, this change has to happen at the systemic level. Simply changing our interpersonal behavior is not going to change the system, right? It also means that we must recognize that not all hurtful words or deeds are equal in their consequences, right? So this is the key difference Tatum is also making between prejudice and discrimination. Anybody can be prejudiced, right? If I'm making assumptions about a white person, that's prejudice. Prejudice can be hurtful. Prejudice can be unfair, right? But it's not the same as discrimination. Because in the larger scheme of things, there's a group of people that has advantages and the other group that does not have those advantages, right? Similarly, when we say, well, anybody should be able to use the N-word, we have to understand that these words and deeds exist in a historical context, right? In the context of domination, violence, oppression. And therefore, conflating these terms and equating different experiences is only going to perpetuate racial hierarchy. So often folks are left wondering, again, what can we do with our privilege? If you have any kind of privilege, it could be white privilege, it could be patriarchal privilege, it could be cisgender privilege, right? Here are some concrete examples of what you can do if you're aspiring to become an accomplice, an ally, right? And we always say in allyship, you have to come in with the mindset of solidarity rather than charity. Because if you come in with the attitude of charity, it's not going to go so well, right? And you'll be left thinking, hey, I'm the good guy. I'm here to help you unfortunate folks. But you might get a very hostile response, right? And so it's really important to do our homework before we engage in these issues. Also remembering that people of color are not on call to explain to you what racism is. So we need to do our own education, right? We need to center marginalized voices. We need to think before we appropriate cultures of marginalized groups. We need to demand equity in our workplace, our school environments. And we have to reevaluate our interpersonal relationships as well, right? We have to hold our public officials accountable, and we have to question and oppose preferential treatment for whites in all public spaces and institutions. And as we noticed with Jackson Katz's work on anti-violence, accomplices have that role. Because you have a privileged position, you can make a big difference. People will often listen to you because you hold that dominant position. Connected to white privilege is the idea of colorblindness, and the reading I assigned to you was by Bonilla Silva, who is seen as the person at the forefront of conceptualizing colorblindness. In our American society, colorblindness is often upheld as a virtue. I think a lot of schools, parents feel like teaching their kids that race or color doesn't matter is an important thing. And so on the face of it, colorblindness seems like it's progressive and so on. But Bonilla Silva is pointing out that it in fact is a modern form of racism, right? Because colorblind racism is often characterized by these features that we list here. One is pushing this idea of meritocracy, that US is a society that's fair, that's based on merit, which is absolutely a myth, right? If you look at any historical moment. The other argument is that, well, we have segregation in our society, but it's only natural for folks to stick to their own kind, as though it just naturally happened. Whereas we know from evidence that the fact that our communities are segregated is a product of federal policy making. It didn't just happen on its own, right? There's also a tendency to talk about pathological cultures that certain groups have, right? Which is like, oh, well, they kind of brought this upon themselves, right? Because they have some pathologies in their culture, like single parent households, and, a lot of like lack of interest in schooling and things like that. And that kind of stereotyping continues, right? Folks often start off a sentence saying, I'm not racist, but, which means they're going to say a bunch of racist stuff right after that phrase. And there's often a minimization of race by accusing marginalized folks of playing the race card, right? In fact, that further devolves into arguments of reverse racism or reverse discrimination, which is kind of trying to create a scenario saying, oh, it sucks to be white now because you won't get any special treatment, which is incredibly ironic because throughout our entire history, it's a group of people that has not only received special treatment, but the whole world has been built for them, right? So what ends up happening is that when you're part of the dominant group, the existing institutions just seem normal and natural to you, right? And when you have that sense of entitlement, it feels like if you make any changes to that, then these other folks are now all of a sudden getting special treatment, right? So privilege and entitlement work in that way. The folks who have it rarely notice it and rarely acknowledge it. So we are done with our module on race and racism. In our next module, some of these ideas and concepts we learned will help us understand the role of immigration in forming race relations in the US, right? So we talked about the black-white relationship, and we're going to complicate that now more by talking about groups that go beyond black or white.